You know what they say about children who've seen too much? That their eyes hold secrets darker than midnight itself. Well, let me tell you about a boy whose story will chill you to the bone. Before we dive into this haunting tale from 1856 Louisiana, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more incredible stories, share this video with someone who loves dramatic narratives, and comment below telling us where you're watching from. We love connecting with viewers from around the world. Now let's step back in time to witness how a 13-year-old slave boy became the most feared person on an entire plantation. My name is Eli, and I was 13 when they dragged me in chains to the DuPont plantation in Baton Rouge. The year was 1856, and the Louisiana heat pressed down like God's own furnace, making the shackles around my wrists burn against my dark skin. I remember every detail of that day. The way the Spanish moss hung like funeral shrouds from the ancient oak trees, the smell of sugarcane rotting in the fields, and the cold stare of Master DuPont as he examined me like livestock. "This one's got the devil in his eyes," muttered old Pete, the head overseer, spitting tobacco juice into the red dirt. His mama was burned as a witch down in New Orleans. Folks say she could curse a man just by looking at him. Master DuPont, a tall man with graying temples and hands soft from never working a day in his life, circled me slowly. His pale blue eyes studied my face, searching for something. 13 years old, you say? He looks older, smarter. He paused in front of me, close enough that I could smell the whiskey on his breath. "What's your name, boy?" "Eli, master," I replied, keeping my voice steady despite the rage burning in my chest. Inside, I was screaming. Inside, I was planning. The plantation stretched out before us like a kingdom of misery. The main house stood proud and white, with its grand columns and wraparound porch where the master's family sipped sweet tea while we bled in the fields. Behind it, rows of slave quarters lined the dirt path like broken teeth, each cabin housing families torn apart by sale and death. The sugarcane fields extended beyond sight, a green ocean where dreams went to die. "Put him with the field hands," Master DuPont decided. "But watch him. Something about this one." He didn't finish the sentence, but I saw the unease in his eyes. Good. Fear was the first seed I would plant. They assigned me to a cabin with 3 other slaves. Marcus, a giant of a man whose back was crisscrossed with whip scars. Sarah, an older woman who hummed spirituals while she cooked. And little Tom, barely older than me, but already broken by years of brutality. That first night, as we sat around a small fire eating thin gruel, they tried to warn me. "Keep your head down, boy," Marcus whispered, his voice like gravel. "Don't look the master in the eye. Don't speak unless spoken to. And whatever you do, don't cross Overseer Pete. That man's got a taste for blood." Sarah nodded, her weathered hands clasping mine. "Your mama's reputation follows you, child. Some folks here think you got her gifts. That might protect you, or it might get you killed." I listened to their warnings, but my mind was elsewhere. I was thinking about my mother, Rebecca, and how they'd tied her to a stake in the town square. I was thinking about the way she'd looked at me through the flames, her lips moving in what the crowd thought was a curse, but was actually a promise. "Make them pay, my son. Make them all pay." The next morning, I learned the rhythm of plantation life. We woke before dawn to the clanging of the overseer's bell, stumbled to the fields in darkness, and worked until our hands bled and our backs screamed. The Louisiana sun was merciless, turning the air thick as molasses and making every breath feel like drowning. But while the others focused on survival, I focused on observation. I watched Master DuPont's wife, Madame Celeste, as she wandered the plantation grounds like a ghost in white linen. Her eyes held a desperate loneliness that made her dangerous. Lonely people were always the easiest to manipulate. I studied Overseer Pete's routines, noting when he drank, when he slept, and which slaves he favored with his particular brand of cruelty. Most importantly, I listened. Slaves talk. In the fields, in the quarters, during the brief moments when the overseers weren't watching, they talk. And in their whispered conversations, I began to piece together the secrets that would become my weapons. Master DuPont had gambling debts in New Orleans. Madame Celeste took laudanum for her nerves. The master's brother had died under suspicious circumstances, and somewhere on this plantation was a child who didn't belong in the slave quarters, but couldn't live in the main house. By the end of my first week, I had already identified my first target. During Sunday prayers, the one day we were allowed to rest, I approached old Pete while he dozed under a magnolia tree, a bottle of corn whiskey half empty beside him. "Overseer Pete," I said softly, making him jolt awake. His hand instinctively went to the whip at his belt. "What you want, boy? You know better than to bother me on my rest day." I kept my expression innocent, childlike. "I was just wondering, sir, that boy working in the stables, the one with the light skin and green eyes, he sure does look familiar. Reminds me of someone important." Pete's face went pale beneath his sunburn. "You best keep your mouth shut about things that ain't your business, boy." "Yes, sir," I replied meekly. "I was just making conversation. My mama always said I had a good eye for family resemblances." The mention of my mother made him flinch. Good. Let him remember what happened to people who crossed a witch's son. That night, as I lay on my straw mattress listening to the others sleep, I smiled for the first time since arriving at the plantation. The game had begun, and I held all the cards. They thought they owned me, but they were wrong. I belonged to no one now except the darkness that had taken root in my heart the day they burned my mother alive. Tomorrow, I would begin to tear their world apart, piece by piece, secret by secret. And when I was finished, there would be nothing left but ashes and the memory of a 13-year-old boy who refused to be broken. The Louisiana night pressed down around us, thick with humidity and the promise of storms to come. In the distance, an owl called out like a warning, but no one was listening. They should have been. 3 weeks had passed since my arrival at the DuPont plantation, and I had become invisible in the way that only slaves could, present but unseen, working but unnoticed. This invisibility was my greatest weapon. While they saw only another field hand, I was mapping every weakness, every secret, every crack in their perfect white facade. The breakthrough came on a sweltering Tuesday morning when I was assigned to help repair the stable roof. The work put me close to the main house, close enough to observe the daily routines of the DuPont family. That's when I saw him clearly for the first time. The boy I'd mentioned to Overseer Pete. His name was Jacques, and he worked in the stables tending to Master DuPont's prized horses. At first glance, he appeared to be just another slave, but my trained eye caught the details others missed. His skin was too light, a café au lait shade that spoke of mixed heritage. His hair had a slight wave that suggested European blood. Most telling of all were his eyes, the same pale blue as Master DuPont's, set in a face that was unmistakably the Master's own features softened by African beauty. I watched Jacques throughout the morning, noting how he moved with unconscious confidence, how the other slaves deferred to him slightly, and how Overseer Pete avoided looking at him directly. This boy was Master DuPont's son, born of a slave woman, and hidden in plain sight. During the lunch break, I approached Jacques, while he groomed a magnificent chestnut mare. The stable was dim and cool, filled with the comforting sounds of horses shifting in their stalls and the buzz of flies in the summer heat. "Beautiful horse," I said casually, running my hand along the mare's flank. Jacques looked up, his blue eyes wary. "You're the new boy. Eli, right? The one whose mama—" He didn't finish the sentence. "Was burned as a witch, yes." I kept my voice matter of fact. "People seem to think that makes me dangerous." "Does it?" Jacques asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. I smiled, and something in that expression made him step back. "That depends on whether someone gives me a reason to be dangerous. You, for instance, you have nothing to fear from me. We're both outsiders here in our own ways." "I don't know what you mean." "Of course you do." I moved closer, lowering my voice to barely above a whisper. "You know exactly what I mean, Jacques Dupont." The color drained from his face. "My name is Jacques Thibodeau. My mama was Marie Thibodeau, and she died of fever when I was 10. Your mama was Marie Thibodeau, that much is true. But she didn't die of fever, did she? She died in childbirth, giving Master Dupont his second son. A son he could never acknowledge but couldn't bear to sell away." Jacques' hands trembled as he continued brushing the horse. "You don't know what you're talking about." "I know that you've never been sold, despite being old enough and strong enough to bring good money. I know that you're the only slave on this plantation who's never felt Overseer Pete's whip. I know that you eat better than the rest of us and sleep in the stable instead of the quarters." I paused, letting each word sink in. "And I know that every Sunday, Master Dupont finds an excuse to walk through the stables just to look at you. Tears began to form in Jacques' eyes. "Even if what you're saying is true, what does it matter? I'm still a slave. I'll always be a slave." "That's where you're wrong," I said softly. "Knowledge is power, Jacques, and the knowledge of who you really are, that's the kind of power that can change everything." Over the following days, I began to cultivate my relationship with Jacques. I was careful, patient, never pushing too hard or revealing too much of my true intentions. I positioned myself as his friend, his confidant, the only person who truly understood his unique position on the plantation. I learned that Jacques had suspected his parentage for years, but had never dared voice it aloud. He lived in constant fear that someone would discover the truth and that Master Dupont would be forced to sell him to protect his reputation. This fear made him compliant, grateful for the small mercies he received, never questioning why he was treated differently from the other slaves. "Have you ever wondered," I asked him one evening as we sat in the stable watching the sunset paint the sky blood red, "what would happen if Madame Celeste knew about you?" Jacques flinched. "Don't even think such things, Eli. It would mean death for both of us. Would it? Or would it mean freedom?" I let the question hang in the air like smoke. "Think about it, Jacques. Master Dupont's wife is a proud woman from one of the oldest families in Louisiana. How do you think she'd react to learning that her husband has been keeping his bastard son right under her nose for 16 years? She'd have us both killed, maybe. Or maybe she'd see an opportunity for revenge against a husband who's humiliated her. Maybe she'd realize that a scandal like this could destroy the Dupont name forever unless she controlled how the information was used." I could see the wheels turning in Jacques' mind, fear warring with a desperate hope he'd never allowed himself to feel. This was the moment I'd been building toward, the crack in the foundation that would bring down the entire structure. "What are you suggesting?" he whispered. "I'm suggesting that secrets are only powerful when they're kept in the dark. But when they're brought into the light at the right moment, by the right person, they can change the world." I stood up, brushing hay from my clothes. "Think about it, Jacques. Think about what you really want from this life." That night, I lay awake, planning my next move. I had identified the secret that could destroy Master Dupont, and I had found the perfect weapon to deliver it. But timing was everything. I needed to wait for the right moment, the perfect opportunity to light the fuse that would blow apart this family's carefully constructed world. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. 3 days later, during the evening meal in the main house, I was serving water to the family when I overheard Madame Celeste complaining to her husband about the upcoming visit from her sister, Madame Rousseau, a notorious gossip from New Orleans society. "She's always looking for scandal, Charles," Madame Celeste said, her voice tight with anxiety. "Ever since that business with the Trem family last year, she's been insufferable. I just pray she doesn't find anything here to sink her teeth into." Master Dupont's eyes flickered nervously toward the window that overlooked the stables. "There's nothing for her to find, my dear. Nothing at all." But I saw the sweat beading on his forehead, and I knew that Madame Rousseau's visit would be the perfect storm I'd been waiting for. As I refilled their water glasses, I caught Master Dupont's eye and smiled, just a small, knowing smile that made his hand shake as he reached for his wine. The game was accelerating, and soon, very soon, the first domino would fall. Madame Rousseau arrived on a humid Thursday morning in a carriage that gleamed like a black beetle in the Louisiana sun. She was a thin, sharp-featured woman, with eyes like a hawk and a tongue that could cut glass. I watched from the fields as she swept up the front steps of the main house, her silk dress rustling with each calculated movement. She had come to hunt for scandal, and I was about to give her a feast. But first I had another piece to move on my chessboard, Madame Celeste herself. I had been observing the master's wife for weeks, noting her habits, her weaknesses, her desperate loneliness. She was a woman trapped in a gilded cage, married to a man who barely acknowledged her existence, except when society demanded it. She spent her days wandering the plantation like a ghost, taking laudanum for her nerves, and staring out at the fields with eyes that held a hunger she couldn't name. The opportunity presented itself 2 days after Madame Rousseau's arrival. I was working in the garden behind the main house, pruning the rose bushes that Madame Celeste tended with obsessive care. The afternoon heat was oppressive, and I had removed my shirt, my dark skin gleaming with sweat as I worked. I sensed her watching me before I saw her. "Boy," she called softly from the shade of the veranda. Come here." I approached slowly, keeping my eyes downcast in the manner expected of a slave, but I was acutely aware of how I looked: young, strong, dangerous in the way that forbidden things always are. I had learned from my mother that power often lay in understanding what people wanted, even when they didn't understand it themselves. "Yes, madame," I said, my voice carefully respectful. She studied me with an intensity that made the air between us crackle with tension. "You're the new boy, the one they say has unusual gifts. I'm just a field hand, madame, nothing more. Don't lie to me." Her voice was sharp, but underneath I heard something else: curiosity, excitement, a desperate need for something real in her artificial world. "I've heard the stories about your mother, about what you can do." I raised my eyes to meet hers, and I saw her breath catch. "What would you like me to do, madame?" The question hung between us like a loaded gun. I watched as she struggled with herself. Propriety warring with desire, fear battling with fascination. She was a woman who had been denied agency her entire life, first by her father, then by her husband. The idea that a 13-year-old slave boy might hold some kind of power was intoxicating to her. "I want," she began, then stopped, her hand fluttering to her throat. "I want to know if the stories are true, if you can really see things, know things." I stepped closer, close enough that I could smell her perfume mixed with the sweet scent of laudanum. "I can see that you're lonely, madame. I can see that you're afraid, and I can see that you're looking for something your husband can't give you." Her face went pale, then flushed red. "How dare you speak to me like that? I should have you whipped." "But you won't," I said softly, "because I'm the first person in years who's told you the truth, and because you need someone to see you, really see you, more than you need to maintain the pretense." For a moment, I thought she might strike me. Her hand raised, trembling with rage and something else, but then she lowered it and I saw tears in her eyes. "What do you want from me?" she whispered. "Nothing, madame. I'm here to serve, nothing more. But if you ever need someone to talk to, someone who understands what it's like to be powerless." I let the sentence trail off, planting the seed that would grow into my next weapon. Over the following days, Madame Celeste began to seek me out. It started innocently enough. She would find excuses to walk through the garden while I worked, asking questions about the plants, about my life before the plantation. But gradually, the conversations became more personal, more intimate. She told me about her childhood in New Orleans, about the arranged marriage that had brought her to the plantation, about the children she'd lost to fever and the husband who blamed her for their deaths. I listened with the patience of a confessor, offering just enough sympathy to keep her talking, just enough understanding to make her feel seen. "Sometimes I feel like I'm disappearing," she confided one afternoon as we sat in the garden pavilion, hidden from view by climbing jasmine. "Like I'm becoming invisible even to myself." "You're not invisible to me, madame," I said, and the way I looked at her made her shiver despite the heat. It was during one of these conversations that I made my move. Madame Rousseau had been at the plantation for a week, and I could see the strain wearing on both Madame Celeste and her husband. The visiting sister had already made several pointed comments about the interesting mix of slaves on the plantation, and I knew she was close to discovering the truth about Jacques. "Madame," I said as we sat in the garden that evening, the air heavy with the scent of night-blooming jasmine, "may I ask you something?" "Of course." "Do you ever wonder why your husband spends so much time in the stables? Why he seems so protective of that boy Jacques?" I watched as understanding dawned in her eyes, followed quickly by a rage so pure it took my breath away. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that some secrets are too heavy for one person to carry alone. And I'm saying that a woman as intelligent as you deserves to know the truth about her own household." The next morning, I watched from the fields as Madame Celeste made her way to the stables. I had given her just enough information to confirm what she had probably suspected for years, but had been too afraid to acknowledge. Jacques was her husband's son, living proof of his infidelity and her own failure to provide him with a male heir. What happened next exceeded even my expectations. Instead of confronting her husband directly, Madame Celeste did something far more devastating. She invited Madame Rousseau to join her for a tour of the plantation, including the stables where Jacques worked. I positioned myself where I could observe the encounter. Madame Rousseau's sharp eyes immediately picked up on the family resemblance, and her delighted gasp was audible even from my hiding place. Within minutes, she was asking pointed questions about Jacques' parentage, his treatment on the plantation, and the implications for the Dupont family's reputation. "My dear Celeste," I heard Madame Rousseau say, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "Surely you must have known the resemblance is quite striking." Madame Celeste's response was perfect, a carefully crafted performance of shock, hurt, and betrayal that would have convinced anyone. I had no idea. Charles never... How could he keep this from me? That evening, the main house erupted in screaming. Through the windows, I could see Madame Celeste confronting her husband, while Madame Rousseau watched with obvious delight. Master Dupont's denials grew weaker with each accusation, and I knew that by morning, the story would be spreading through New Orleans society like wildfire. But the most satisfying moment came later that night, when Madame Celeste found me in the garden. Her eyes were wild with rage and something else, a desperate gratitude that made her dangerous. "You knew," she said. "You knew, and you told me." "I thought you deserved the truth, madame." She stepped closer, so close I could feel her breath on my face. "What else do you know? What other secrets is my husband keeping?" I smiled, and in that smile was the promise of more revelations to come. "There's so much more, madam, so much more." And then, in a moment that would have meant death for both of us if we'd been discovered, she kissed me. It was brief, desperate, a kiss that tasted of laudanum and revenge, and the sweet poison of forbidden desire. When she pulled away, her eyes held a new light, the light of a woman who had finally found her weapon. "Tell me everything," she whispered. "I want to know it all." The trap was set, and the prey was walking willingly into my web. The storm that had been building for days finally broke on a Tuesday night in late August. But the tempest outside was nothing compared to the one I was about to unleash within the walls of the Dupont plantation. Lightning split the sky like God's own whip, and thunder rolled across the sugarcane fields with the sound of approaching judgment. I had spent the week since Madame Celeste's kiss carefully orchestrating the next phase of my plan. The revelation about Jacques had created exactly the chaos I'd hoped for. Master Dupont was drinking more heavily, Madame Celeste was consumed with rage and humiliation, and Madame Rousseau was preparing to return to New Orleans with enough scandal to destroy the Dupont name forever. But I wasn't finished, not nearly finished. The key to my next move lay in understanding the delicate balance of power between Master Dupont and his overseer, Pete Thibodeau. Yes, Thibodeau. I had discovered that old Pete was actually Jacques' uncle, Marie's brother, which explained his protective attitude toward the boy. This family connection made Pete both an asset and a liability to Master Dupont, someone who knew too much but couldn't be easily dismissed. I had been watching Pete carefully, noting his routines, his weaknesses, his fears. He was a man driven by greed and paranoia, always looking over his shoulder, always worried that someone might discover his own secrets. And Pete had secrets. I had learned that he'd been skimming money from the plantation's profits for years, selling sugar on the side and pocketing the proceeds. The storm provided the perfect cover for what I had planned. As rain lashed against the windows and wind howled through the trees, I made my way to Master Dupont's study. I had learned the layout of the main house during my weeks of service, and I knew that the master kept his important papers in a locked drawer of his mahogany desk. The lock was old and simple, easily picked with a piece of wire I'd fashioned for the purpose. Inside, I found exactly what I was looking for: correspondence between Master Dupont and his creditors in New Orleans, records of the plantation's finances, and most importantly, a ledger that detailed every transaction involving the sale and purchase of slaves. But I wasn't there to steal, I was there to create. Working by candlelight, I carefully forged a letter in Master Dupont's handwriting, a skill my mother had taught me during our long evenings together before her death. The letter was addressed to a fictional buyer in Mobile, Alabama, and it detailed the planned sale of the overseer's nephew, Jacques, and several other prime field hands to cover mounting gambling debts. The letter was a masterpiece of deception, written in Master Dupont's flowery style and including details that only he would know. I made sure to mention Pete by name, suggesting that the overseer had been reluctant to cooperate with the sale of his nephew, but would come around once he understands the financial necessities. I sealed the letter with wax from Master Dupont's own seal and placed it where Pete would be sure to find it, tucked partially under a stack of papers on the desk, as if it had been hastily hidden when someone interrupted the master's work. The next morning, I made sure Pete had reason to enter the study. I approached him as he made his rounds, my expression carefully crafted to show fear and urgency. "Overseer Pete," I said, wringing my hands nervously, "Master Dupont wants to see you in his study right away. He seemed angry about something." Pete's face darkened. "What's he angry about now?" "I don't know, sir. But I heard him talking to Madame Celeste about money troubles. Something about having to make some hard decisions." I watched as fear flickered across Pete's weathered features. He knew about Master Dupont's gambling debts, knew how desperate the man had become. The idea that he might be forced to make sacrifices to cover those debts was exactly the kind of paranoid thought that would drive Pete to investigate. 20 minutes later, I heard the explosion. "You lying, cheating son of a bitch!" Pete's voice carried across the plantation grounds like thunder. "You think you can sell my nephew behind my back? You think you can throw away my family like they're nothing?" I positioned myself where I could observe the confrontation through the study window. Master Dupont looked genuinely confused, which only made Pete angrier. The overseer was waving the forged letter in the air, his face purple with rage. "I don't know what you're talking about, Pete," Master Dupont said, reaching for the letter. "Let me see that." "Don't you dare touch it." Pete snatched the letter back. "I found it right here on your desk, your own handwriting, your own seal. You were planning to sell Jacques to cover your gambling debts, and you were going to blame me for not cooperating." Master Dupont's face went white as he recognized his own handwriting, his own seal. But I could see the confusion in his eyes. He had no memory of writing such a letter because he hadn't written it. The confusion only made him look more guilty. "Pete, I swear to you, I never wrote that letter. Someone must have what? Forged your handwriting? Used your private seal? You think I'm stupid, Charles?" Pete's hand moved to the pistol at his belt. "You think because I can't read fancy books like you, I can't see what's right in front of my face?" The argument escalated quickly, fueled by years of resentment and mistrust. Pete accused Master Dupont of treating him like a servant, despite their business partnership. Master Dupont accused Pete of stealing from the plantation and using his position to protect his own interests. Both accusations were true, which made them even more explosive. "You want to sell my nephew?" Pete snarled, drawing his pistol. "Then you can explain to him yourself why his own father is throwing him away like garbage." "His father?" Master Dupont's voice cracked. "What are you talking about? Don't play dumb with me, Charles. We both know Jacques is your boy. Marie told me before she died, said you promised to take care of him, to make sure he was never sold away. Guess your promises don't mean much when money's involved." The revelation hit Master Dupont like a physical blow. He staggered backward, his face cycling through shock, denial, and finally, a terrible understanding. "You've known all along. You've known Jacques was my son and you never said anything? What was I supposed to say? That my sister was good enough to warm your bed but not good enough to marry? That her son was good enough to be your heir, but only if nobody knew the truth?" Pete's voice was thick with years of suppressed rage. "I kept your secret, Charles. I protected your reputation, and this is how you repay me." The storm outside seemed to intensify, as if nature itself was responding to the violence brewing in the study. Lightning illuminated the two men facing each other like gunfighters, years of partnership dissolving into hatred and betrayal. "Pete, please," Master Dupont said, raising his hands. "We can work this out. I never intended to sell Jacques. That letter, there must be some explanation. The only explanation is that you're a lying, cheating coward who'd sell his own son to pay his gambling debts." Pete cocked his pistol. "Well, I've got news for you, Charles. Some things ain't for sale." The gunshot was lost in a crash of thunder, but I saw Master Dupont fall, clutching his shoulder as blood seeped through his white shirt. Pete stood over him, the smoking pistol still in his hand, his face a mask of rage and satisfaction. "Next time I won't miss," Pete growled. "So you try to sell Jacques, you try to sell any of my people, and I'll put a bullet in your heart, you understand me?" Master Dupont nodded weakly, his face gray with shock and pain. Pete holstered his pistol and stormed out of the study, leaving his former partner bleeding on the Persian carpet. As I watched from my hiding place, I felt a deep satisfaction settle in my chest. The letter had worked perfectly, turning allies into enemies and exposing the rotten foundation their partnership was built on. But this was just the beginning. The real destruction was yet to come. That night, as the storm raged and Master Dupont lay in his bed with a doctor tending his wound, I smiled in the darkness of my cabin. The plantation was tearing itself apart exactly as I had planned, and tomorrow I would plant the seeds for the next phase of their destruction. The storm outside was ending, but the storm I had created was just beginning to build. The shooting of Master Dupont sent shockwaves through the plantation like ripples in a poisoned pond. Within hours, the story had spread to every cabin, every field, every corner of the Dupont estate. But as the tale passed from mouth to mouth, it began to change, to grow, to take on a life of its own, and I made sure to guide that growth in exactly the direction I wanted. "I heard it was the boy," whispered Sarah as we worked in the cotton fields 3 days after the shooting. "That new boy, Eli, they say he cursed Master Dupont, made Pete's hand move on its own." "That's nonsense," Marcus replied, but his voice lacked conviction. "Pete shot the master because of that letter about selling Jacques. Had nothing to do with witchcraft." "Then how do you explain the letter?" asked little Tom, his eyes wide with fear. "Master Dupont swears he never wrote it, but it was in his own hand with his own seal. How does a letter write itself?" I listened to their conversation while keeping my head down, my hands busy with the cotton bolls. This was exactly what I had hoped for. The slaves were beginning to question the natural order of things, to wonder if forces beyond their understanding were at work on the plantation. "My grandmother used to tell stories," Sarah continued, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper, "about children born with the sight, children who could make things happen just by willing them. She said they were marked by tragedy, touched by the spirits of the dead." "You think Eli's one of them?" little Tom asked, glancing nervously in my direction. "I think," Sarah said slowly, "that boy's mama didn't die for nothing. I think she passed something on to him before they burned her. Something powerful, something dangerous. That evening I decided it was time to feed the growing legend. I waited until the others in my cabin were asleep, then slipped out into the humid Louisiana night. The plantation was eerily quiet, with only the sound of crickets and the distant hoot of an owl to break the silence. I made my way to the edge of the cornfield, where the tall stalks created a maze of shadows and whispered secrets. This was where I would stage my first supernatural encounter, carefully crafted to convince the other slaves that I possessed powers beyond their understanding. I had prepared for this moment, gathering materials over the past week. Phosphorus scraped from match heads, which would glow with an eerie green light when mixed with water, a small mirror that could reflect moonlight in unexpected ways, and most importantly, my mother's voice, which I could mimic with uncanny accuracy. I positioned myself deep in the cornfield and began to speak in my mother's voice, letting the words carry on the night air. "Eli, my son, make them pay. Make them all pay." The effect was immediate. I heard movement from the slave quarters, whispered conversations, the sound of doors creaking open. Within minutes, several slaves had gathered at the edge of the cornfield, drawn by the impossible sound of a dead woman's voice. "You hear that?" whispered Marcus, his massive frame trembling with fear. "It's her," Sarah breathed. "It's Rebecca. She's come back." I continued the performance, moving through the cornstalks while maintaining the illusion of my mother's voice. I used the phosphorus to create ghostly lights that danced between the plants, and I positioned the mirror to catch the moonlight and throw it in unexpected directions. "The boy," my mother's voice seemed to say. "Protect the boy. He carries my power. He carries my vengeance." By the time I made my way back to the cabin, the entire slave population was buzzing with excitement and terror. They had seen the lights, heard the voice, felt the presence of something otherworldly in their midst. And when they found me apparently asleep in my bed, having never left the cabin at all, the legend was complete. Over the following days, I carefully cultivated this new reputation. I would make cryptic comments that seemed to predict future events I was actually planning to cause. I would stare at people with an intensity that made them uncomfortable, as if I could see into their souls. Most importantly, I would occasionally speak in my mother's voice when I thought no one was listening, letting them overhear conversations with the dead. The effect on the plantation was profound. The slaves began to treat me with a mixture of fear and reverence, believing that I was protected by supernatural forces. They would bring me small offerings, extra food, tobacco, even coins they had managed to save, hoping to curry favor with the spirits that surrounded me. But more importantly, They began to see me as a source of power in their powerless world. When old Pete cracked his whip a little too enthusiastically, they would whisper that Eli's mama was watching. When Master Dupont's wound became infected and he developed a fever, they credited it to my supernatural influence. The boys got the sight, I heard one of the field hands tell another. He can see things before they happen, make things happen just by thinking about them. His mama's spirit guides him, tells him secrets from beyond the grave. I used this growing reputation to gather information and allies. Slaves who had been reluctant to talk to me before now sought me out, eager to share their secrets with someone they believed had supernatural protection. I learned about hidden escape routes, about which overseers could be bribed, about the complex web of relationships that bound the plantation together. Most importantly, I learned about the growing tension between the house slaves and the field slaves, a division that I could exploit for my own purposes. The house slaves, led by an elderly woman named Mama Josephine, looked down on the field hands and considered themselves superior because of their proximity to the white family. This arrogance made them perfect targets for manipulation. I began to plant seeds of discord between the two groups, using my supposed supernatural knowledge to reveal embarrassing secrets and create conflicts. I told the field hands that Mama Josephine had been stealing food from their rations to feed the house slaves better. I told the house slaves that the field hands were planning to implicate them in any future escape attempts. The spirits tell me things, I would say with an innocent expression. They show me what people do when they think no one is watching. The plantation was becoming a powder keg of suspicion and fear, with me at the center of it all. The slaves were divided against each other. The white family was torn apart by scandal and violence, and everyone was looking over their shoulders, wondering what supernatural force might strike next. But the most satisfying moment came when Jacques approached me one evening as I sat alone by the edge of the cornfield. The boy who had once been confident in his special status now looked haunted, uncertain of his place in the world. "Eli," he said quietly, "people are saying things about you. Strange things." "People say a lot of things," I replied, not looking at him. "Most of it's nonsense. Is it?" Jacques sat down beside me, his voice barely above a whisper. "Because ever since you came here, everything's been falling apart. My uncle shot Master Dupont. Madame Celeste knows about me. The whole plantation's talking about ghosts and curses." I turned to look at him, and I let him see something cold and ancient in my eyes. "Maybe it's not about what I've done, Jacques. Maybe it's about what was always going to happen. Maybe some things are just inevitable." "What do you want from me?" he asked, and I could hear the fear in his voice. "I want you to remember that blood doesn't make you safe," I said softly. "I want you to remember that secrets have a way of coming to light, and I want you to remember that when this is all over, there will be only two kinds of people left. Those who stood with me and those who stood against me." That night, as I lay in my bed listening to the whispered conversations of my cabin mates, I smiled in the darkness. The legend of Eli the witch boy was growing stronger every day, and with it, my power over everyone on the plantation. Soon, very soon, it would be time for the final act of my revenge. And when that moment came, they would all understand that some children are born not to be broken, but to break others. The voices in the cornfield would continue to whisper, and everyone would listen, because they had no choice but to believe. October arrived like a fever dream, bringing with it the kind of oppressive heat that makes men do desperate things. The plantation had become a tinderbox of suspicion, fear, and barely contained violence. Master Dupont's shoulder had healed poorly, leaving him with a permanent reminder of Pete's betrayal. Madame Celeste had descended into a laudanum-fueled madness, alternating between rage and despair, and the slaves whispered constantly about the witch boy who could speak to the dead and bend reality to his will. I had spent weeks positioning all the pieces on my chessboard, and now it was time for the final gambit. The destruction of the Dupont family would not come from a single devastating blow, but from a cascade of carefully orchestrated disasters that would leave nothing standing in their wake. The first domino fell on a Tuesday morning when Madame Rousseau returned from New Orleans with news that would shatter what remained of the family's reputation. She arrived in her black carriage like a harbinger of doom, her sharp features twisted with malicious delight. I was serving breakfast in the main house when she delivered her poison with surgical precision. "My dear Celeste," she said, her voice dripping with false sympathy, "I'm afraid I have some rather distressing news from the city. It seems word of your domestic difficulty has reached certain circles." Master Dupont's coffee cup rattled against its saucer. "What kind of word?" "Oh, you know how these things spread, Charles. A whisper here, a rumor there. Before you know it, everyone's talking about the prominent planter who keeps his bastard son as a stable boy and shoots business partners who threaten to expose his secrets." Madame Celeste's face went white. "What exactly are people saying?" "They're saying that the Dupont name has become synonymous with scandal. They're saying that no respectable family would consider marriage alliances with a house so tainted by impropriety. They're saying," Madame Rousseau paused for dramatic effect, "that your creditors are beginning to question whether the plantation is a sound investment." The words hit Master Dupont like physical blows. His gambling debts were already crushing him, and if his creditors lost confidence in the plantation's stability, they would demand immediate payment. Payment he couldn't possibly make. "There must be something we can do," he said desperately. "Some way to contain the damage." Madame Rousseau smiled like a shark scenting blood. "Oh, my dear Charles, I'm afraid the damage is quite beyond containment, but perhaps there might be a way to salvage something from the wreckage." She leaned forward conspiratorially. "I've been speaking with certain interested parties in New Orleans, investors who might be willing to purchase the plantation at a reduced price. Of course, such a sale would require the current owners to relocate somewhere far from Louisiana. Perhaps Texas or even California." I watched from my position by the sideboard as the full implications sank in. Madame Rousseau wasn't just delivering bad news, she was orchestrating a hostile takeover, using the family's scandals as leverage to force a sale at a fraction of the plantation's true value. Master Dupont's hands shook as he set down his coffee cup. "You're talking about destroying everything my family has built for 3 generations. I'm talking about salvaging what can be salvaged before everything is lost completely," Madame Rousseau replied coolly. "The choice is yours, Charles. Sell now and retain some dignity, or wait for your creditors to seize everything and leave you with nothing but shame." That afternoon, I put the second phase of my plan into motion. I had been carefully cultivating a relationship with Mama Josephine, the head house slave, feeding her information about the family's financial troubles and the growing instability of the plantation. Now it was time to use that relationship to devastating effect. I found her in the kitchen preparing dinner with hands that shook from both age and anxiety. "Mama Josephine," I said quietly, "I need to tell you something. Something the spirits showed me in a dream." Her eyes widened with fear and fascination. Over the past weeks, she had become one of my most devoted believers, convinced that my supernatural abilities could protect her from the chaos engulfing the plantation. "What did they show you, child?" "They showed me fire," I said, my voice heavy with false sorrow. "Fire consuming everything, leaving nothing but ashes and sorrow. They showed me families torn apart, people scattered to the winds like leaves in a hurricane." "When?" she whispered. "When will this happen?" "Soon, very soon. The spirits say that Master Dupont is planning to sell the plantation to pay his debts. All of us will be sold separately, sent to different plantations, different states. Families will be broken apart forever." The news hit her like a thunderbolt. Mama Josephine had children and grandchildren among the slaves, and the thought of being separated from them was her greatest fear. "What can we do?" she asked desperately. "How can we stop this?" "The spirits say there's only one way," I replied, my voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "We have to make the plantation worthless to any potential buyers. We have to make sure that when the time comes to sell, there's nothing left to sell." I let the implication hang in the air between us, watching as understanding dawned in her eyes. She was thinking about fire, about the sugarcane fields that could burn for days, about the buildings that could be reduced to ash in a single night. "But that would be," she began. "It would be survival," I finished. "It would be the only way to keep our families together. If there's no plantation to sell, there are no slaves to separate." That evening, I made my final preparations. I had spent weeks gathering materials, lamp oil, dry kindling, rags soaked in turpentine. I had mapped out the plantation's most vulnerable points, identifying which buildings would burn fastest and which fires would spread most effectively. But most importantly, I had identified the perfect scapegoat for the destruction I was about to unleash. Pete Thibodeau had been drinking heavily since the shooting, consumed by guilt and paranoia. He knew that his attack on Master Dupont had made him a marked man, and he was looking for any excuse to lash out at the world that had trapped him. I was about to give him that excuse. I approached him as he sat on the porch of his cabin, a bottle of whiskey in his hand and murder in his eyes. "Overseer Pete," I said respectfully, "I heard something today that I thought you should know." He looked up at me with bloodshot eyes. "What now, boy?" "I heard Master Dupont talking to Madame Rousseau about selling the plantation. He said he was going to blame you for all the troubles. Tell the new owners that you were the one who caused all the problems, so they'd have an excuse to get rid of you without paying any severance." Pete's face darkened with rage. "That lying son of a bitch. After everything I've done for him, after all the years I've kept his secrets, he wants to throw me away like garbage." "There's more," I continued, my voice carefully calibrated to fan the flames of his anger. "He said he was going to tell them about the money you've been taking from the sugar sales. Said he had evidence that could put you in prison." The bottle slipped from Pete's hands, shattering on the porch steps. "He wouldn't dare. If he exposes me, I'll expose him. I'll tell everyone about Jacques, about the other slaves he's fathered, about the deals we've made with smugglers." "He doesn't think you'll have the chance," I said softly. "He's planning to have you arrested tomorrow morning. Sheriff's already been contacted." Pete stood up so fast he nearly fell over. "We'll see about that. We'll just see about that." I watched him stumble toward the main house, his hand on his pistol, his face twisted with rage and desperation. This was the moment I had been building toward for months, the moment when all the carefully planted seeds of discord would bloom into beautiful, devastating chaos. The fire started in the sugar mill just after midnight. I had positioned myself where I could observe the conflagration while maintaining my alibi, appearing to be asleep in my cabin when the alarm was raised. The flames spread quickly, fed by the dry wood and the stores of raw sugar that burned like the very fires of hell. By the time the household was roused, half the outbuildings were already engulfed. Master Dupont, still weak from his wound, could only watch helplessly as his life's work went up in smoke. Madame Celeste stood on the front porch in her nightgown, laughing hysterically as the flames painted her face in shades of orange and red. But the fire was only the beginning. As the slaves rushed to form bucket brigades and save what they could, other disasters began to unfold. Pete, drunk and enraged, had confronted Master Dupont in his study, and their argument had escalated into violence. This time, Pete's aim was true. The gunshot that killed Master Dupont was lost in the chaos of the fire, but I saw him fall through the study window, his blood pooling on the same Persian carpet where he had bled weeks before. Pete stood over the body for a moment, then turned the gun on himself, unable to face the consequences of what he had done. Madame Celeste's laughter turned to screams when she discovered the bodies, and those screams turned to silence when she retreated to her bedroom and consumed the entire bottle of laudanum she kept hidden in her vanity. By dawn, she too was dead, her face peaceful in a way it had never been in life. As the sun rose over the smoldering ruins of the Dupont plantation, I stood among the other survivors, my face carefully composed in an expression of shock and grief. Around me, the other slaves wept for the only home they had ever known, not understanding that their liberation had come at the cost of everything they thought they valued. Jacques found me as the morning light revealed the full extent of the destruction. The boy who had once been the master's secret son was now just another orphaned slave, his special status burned away with everything else. "You did this," he said quietly, his blue eyes filled with a terrible understanding. "Somehow you made all of this happen." I looked at him with the innocent expression I had perfected over the months of my campaign. "I'm just a slave boy, Jacques. I don't have the power to make anything happen." "Then how do you explain it? How do you explain that everyone who ever crossed you is dead, and you're the only one who seems to have seen it coming?" I smiled then, and in that smile was all the cold satisfaction of a job well done. "Maybe some people are just unlucky, Jacques. Maybe some families are just cursed." He stared at me for a long moment, then turned and walked away, understanding that he was looking at something far more dangerous than any supernatural force. He was looking at a 13-year-old boy who had learned that the most powerful weapon in the world was the ability to make people destroy themselves. The DuPont plantation was finished, its owners dead, its buildings reduced to ash and memory. And I, the witch boy who had orchestrated it all, was finally truly free. Dawn broke over the ruins of the DuPont plantation like a judgment day, painting the sky in shades of blood and ash. The great house still smoldered, its proud white columns now blackened bones, reaching toward heaven like the fingers of a corpse. The sugar mill was nothing but a crater of twisted metal and charred wood. The slave quarters had been spared, but their inhabitants wandered through the devastation like ghosts, unable to comprehend the magnitude of what had transpired in a single night. I stood at the edge of what had once been the Rose Garden, watching the smoke rise from the ruins of my enemy's empire. The roses Madame Celeste had tended so carefully were now withered and black, their petals scattered like drops of dried blood across the scorched earth. It was a fitting metaphor for everything the DuPont family had built, beautiful on the surface but rotten at the roots. The authorities arrived as the sun climbed higher, their horses' hooves clattering against the cobblestones of the main drive. Sheriff Boudreaux was a fat man with a red face and suspicious eyes, the kind of man who saw conspiracy in every shadow, but was too lazy to investigate properly. Behind him rode the coroner, Dr. Melançon, and a handful of deputies who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. I positioned myself among the other slaves, my face a perfect mask of grief and confusion. I had practiced this expression for hours, studying my reflection in broken pieces of mirror, until I could summon tears on command and make my voice shake with just the right amount of trauma. "Sweet Jesus," Sheriff Boudreaux muttered as he surveyed the destruction. What in the hell happened here? Mama Josephine, who had survived the night but aged a decade in the process, stepped forward to speak for the slaves. Her voice trembled as she recounted the events. The fire that had started in the sugar mill, the chaos that followed, the discovery of the bodies in the main house. "It was like the devil himself came to visit," she said, crossing herself repeatedly. "First the fire, then the shooting, then poor Madame Celeste. Lord have mercy on their souls." The sheriff questioned several of the slaves, but their stories were consistent. They had been fighting the fire when they heard gunshots from the main house. By the time anyone could investigate, Master DuPont and Pete were both dead, and Madame Celeste had locked herself in her room. No one had seen exactly what happened, and in the chaos of the fire, no one had thought to break down her door until it was too late. When Sheriff Boudreaux finally got around to questioning me, I was ready. "You're the new boy," he said, studying me with those suspicious eyes. "The one whose mama was burned for witchcraft." "Yes, sir," I replied, keeping my voice small and frightened. "But I ain't done nothing wrong, sir. I was just trying to help fight the fire like everyone else." "Where were you when the shooting happened?" "In the bucket line, sir. Passing water from the well to try and save the stables. You can ask anyone. They all saw me there. And they had seen me there because I had made sure to be visible at the crucial moments, establishing my alibi while the real drama played out in the main house. The beauty of my plan was that I hadn't actually killed anyone. I had simply created the conditions that made them kill each other." Dr. Melançon emerged from the main house, shaking his head. "Murder-suicide, clear as day," he announced. "Pete Thibodeau shot Charles Dupont, then turned the gun on himself. Probably couldn't live with what he'd done. As for Madame Celeste, she took enough laudanum to kill a horse. Whether it was intentional or accidental," he shrugged. "Does it matter? They're all dead." "What about the fire?" Sheriff Boudreaux asked. "Could have been anything. Knocked over lantern, lightning strike, spontaneous combustion of the sugar stores. These old buildings burn fast once they get started. The important thing is that it looks like an accident." I listened to their conclusions with inner satisfaction. They were so eager to wrap up the case neatly that they weren't asking the right questions. They didn't want to dig deeper, didn't want to uncover the web of secrets and lies that had really destroyed the DuPont family. It was easier to blame it all on bad luck and human weakness. As the authorities prepared to leave, Sheriff Boudreaux addressed the assembled slaves. "Y'all are going to be sold to cover the estate's debts," he announced. "Auction set for next week in Baton Rouge. Until then, you stay put and don't cause any trouble." The news hit the slaves like a physical blow. Families that had hoped to stay together now faced the reality of being scattered to the winds. Children clung to their parents, knowing they might never see each other again. The elderly slaves wept openly, understanding that they were too old to be valuable and would likely be sold to the harshest masters for the lowest prices. But I felt no sympathy for their tears. They had been complicit in their own oppression, accepting their chains so completely that they couldn't imagine life without them. They had bowed and scraped before their masters, grateful for scraps of kindness while ignoring the fundamental injustice of their situation. They deserved whatever fate awaited them. As the days passed before the auction, I began to implement the final phase of my plan. I had no intention of being sold to another plantation, no intention of spending my life in bondage to yet another family of white oppressors. I had tasted freedom in the destruction of the DuPonts, and I would not give it up. The key was Jacques. The boy had been watching me with growing suspicion since the night of the fire, and I knew he was close to understanding the truth about what I had done. But instead of seeing him as a threat, I saw him as an opportunity. I approached him on the third day after the fire, finding him in the ruins of the stable where he had once tended Master DuPont's horses. He was sitting on a charred beam, staring at nothing, his blue eyes empty of hope. "Thinking about your father?" I asked, settling down beside him. He flinched at the word father but didn't deny it. "He's dead because of you." "He's dead because he was a weak man who made weak choices," I corrected. "I didn't force him to father bastard children. I didn't force him to gamble away his fortune. I didn't force him to betray his business partner. I simply illuminated the consequences of his actions. You manipulated everyone. You turned them against each other. I told them the truth about who they really were, what they really wanted, how far they were willing to go to get it. If that destroyed them, it's because they were already rotten inside." Jacques turned to look at me, and I saw something new in his expression. Not just fear, but a grudging respect. "What do you want from me?" "I want you to come with me." "Where?" "North, to the Free States, to Canada maybe. Somewhere we can disappear and start over." I leaned closer, my voice dropping to a whisper. "You're not really a slave, Jacques. You never were. You're the son of a plantation owner, which means you have rights, options, possibilities that the others don't, but only if you're smart enough to claim them. How would we even get away? The auction's in 4 days." I smiled, and in that smile was all the confidence of someone who had already thought through every detail. "Leave that to me. I've been planning this for longer than you know." The night before the auction, I put my escape plan into motion. I had spent weeks studying the plantation's surroundings, identifying the best routes to the river, the safest places to hide during daylight, the contacts who might help runaway slaves for the right price. I'd also been carefully hoarding supplies, food, water, tools, and most importantly, money stolen from the ruins of the main house. But my greatest asset was the reputation I had cultivated among the slaves. They believed I had supernatural powers, that I was protected by the spirits of the dead. This belief would serve me well in the chaos of our escape. I gathered the slaves in the main yard just after midnight, my face painted with ash and my voice pitched to carry the authority of prophecy. "The spirits have spoken to me," I announced, my mother's voice echoing through the darkness. "They say that tomorrow's auction will be a slaughter. They say that families will be torn apart, children sold away from their parents, husbands separated from wives forever." The slaves murmured in fear and despair. They had all been dreading the auction, but hearing it described in supernatural terms made it seem even more terrible. "But the spirits also offer hope," I continued. "They say that those who are brave enough to follow the witch boy into the darkness will find freedom on the other side. They say that the Underground Railroad has agents waiting by the river, ready to guide the faithful to the promised land." It was a lie, of course. There were no agents waiting, no Underground Railroad contacts ready to help. But the slaves wanted to believe, needed to believe, and that made them easy to manipulate. "Who will follow?" I asked. "Who will trust in the power of the spirits to guide them to freedom?" About half the slaves stepped forward, their faces shining with desperate hope. The others hung back, too afraid or too broken to risk everything on the word of a 13-year-old boy. I felt a moment of contempt for their cowardice, but it didn't matter. I only needed a few followers to create the chaos that would cover my real escape. We moved through the darkness like a procession of ghosts, following paths I had scouted weeks earlier. I led them toward the river, but not to freedom, to destruction. When we reached the old ferry crossing, I gave them their final instructions. "The spirits say we must split up here," I announced. "Some of you go north along the river, some go south, some head inland. Spread out so they can't track us all. Meet at the old Trem cemetery in New Orleans in 1 week's time." It was another lie. There would be no reunion, no gathering of escaped slaves in New Orleans. I was sending them in different directions to confuse any pursuit and to ensure that none of them would be around to contradict my story when the authorities came looking for answers. As the group dispersed into the Louisiana wilderness, I slipped away with Jacques, heading not toward freedom but toward a different kind of destiny. We made our way to a small boat I had hidden among the cypress trees, and as we pushed off into the dark waters of the bayou, I felt a deep satisfaction settle in my chest. Behind us, the DuPont plantation lay in ruins, its owners dead, its slaves scattered to the winds. The great house that had stood for 3 generations was now nothing but ash and memory. The family that had built their fortune on the backs of human misery had been destroyed by one of their own victims. And I, the witch boy who had orchestrated it all, was finally free. As dawn broke over the bayou, painting the water in shades of gold and crimson, I stood in the bow of our small boat and smiled. Jacques sat behind me, still uncertain about what we were doing, where we were going, what kind of future awaited us. But I knew exactly what lay ahead. I would disappear into the vast wilderness of America, taking on new names, new identities, new lives as needed. I would use the skills my mother had taught me, the ability to read people, to manipulate their fears and desires, to make them destroy themselves, to carve out a place in the world. And someday, when I was older and stronger and more powerful, I would return to Louisiana. I would find the children and grandchildren of the men who had burned my mother, and I would make them pay for the sins of their fathers. The cycle of vengeance would continue, generation after generation, until every debt was settled and every wrong was made right. The boat carried us deeper into the bayou, away from the smoking ruins of the plantation and toward an uncertain future. But I wasn't afraid. I had learned that the most powerful weapon in the world wasn't a gun or a whip or a chain. It was the ability to understand human nature and use it against itself. I was 13 years old, and I had already destroyed an entire family. I was the witch boy who smiled in the ashes, the child who had refused to be broken, the slave who had turned his masters into slaves of their own weaknesses. And this was only the beginning. As we disappeared into the morning mist, I whispered a promise to the spirits of my ancestors, to the ghost of my mother, to the darkness that lived in my heart. I will never be a victim again. I will never bow to anyone again. And anyone who tries to break me will learn what it means to face the wrath of a child who has nothing left to lose. The bayou swallowed our boat like a hungry mouth, and we vanished into legend, leaving behind only the memory of a boy who had brought down a kingdom with nothing but words, secrets, and the terrible power of truth. In the years that followed, people would tell stories about the DuPont plantation, about the mysterious fire that consumed it, about the family that died in a single night, about the slaves who disappeared without a trace. But they would never know the real truth about what happened there. They would never know about the 13-year-old boy who had orchestrated it all, who had turned their world upside down and walked away smiling. They would never know about Eli, the witch boy who had learned that sometimes the only way to find freedom is to burn everything down and rise from the ashes. And perhaps that was for the best. Some stories are too dark to tell, too terrible to believe, too dangerous to remember. But I remember everything.